So, a little while ago, I did a list of my 50 favourite pro res finishers, and I'm pretty sure I said at the end of that I would eventually do a American-themed one. And well, I guess that time is now. We always like covering moves on this channel, talking about the best lariats, the best power bombs, big moves like the Burning Hammer. Moves is generally a cool subject, a nice chance to cool off and just talk about some things that are pretty damn cool. And so, it's as simple as that. These are my 50 favourite finishers that generally come from America. Obviously we're going to have some quite famous moves here, the sacred cows of wrestling finishers, the ones everybody knows. But, you know, there'll also be some more different, lesser known ones here. So, let's get to it. We start with a pretty big one. It's a tag team finisher and it's the Dudley Death Drop, the 3D. As far as tag team finishers go, there's a couple on this list, generally pretty famous ones, and obviously this is a damn good one. I mean, as soon as you first saw it, it was like, ooh! You know, Devon picks them up, Bubba hits the cutter. Apparently a move that's never been kicked out of. Apparently, according to Bubba Ray anyway. The pin's only ever been broken up. No one's ever actually gotten their shoulder up on a 3D, so it is a pretty protected move, and quite rightly so, because it does look pretty nasty when it's hit right. The Angels wins is second. Christopher Daniels is one of those guys who's got a couple of moves I suppose I could have put in for him. You've got the Lasterites, you've got the BME, the best moonsault ever. But I remember when I first saw Christopher Daniels, he was mainly using the Angel wins as a finisher. Kind of the lifting, sort of, you know, pedigree type thing, with a little bit of a turner. Tommaso Ciampa uses this move nowadays. And I've kind of got this in here in place of the pedigree as well. Pedigree was very close to getting in this top 50, but I always kind of like a move if it's got a little bit extra stank on it, and the lift that Daniels gets on the Angels wins and the little turn, you know, I appreciate that, so I thought I'd stick this in instead of the pedigree. Pedigree gets a lot of love anyway. Another quite big one, the ankle lock here in Kurt Angle's form, although obviously various other people have used this one. Ken Shamrock obviously famously before Angle. This is just kind of one of those perfect submission moves for wrestling. I mean, it doesn't get much simpler than the ankle lock, does it? Basically all you're doing is you're picking someone's leg up and you're trying to take their foot off of their ankle. That's kind of what you're trying to do, or well, their ankle I suppose. You're trying to take their ankle out of their ankle, to quote Owen Hart. And, you know, it's got everything, because then, of course, you've got all the facial expressions. You've got the facial expressions from the poor sod who's in it, and you've got the facial expressions of Kurt Angle as he's utterly raging in, you know, full perk mode, shouting to tap. And then, of course, whenever Angle lays down with it, scissors that leg, you know that's usually the end of the road. A great wrestling submission. Here's the Awful Waffle, Sexy Chucky T, Chuck Taylor, also known as the Amiga Driver. Awful Waffle is just quite a nice and fun name for a move. The sort of one you'd expect from Chuck Taylor, the guy who came up with wrestling gimmick names like Dick the Hammer Dick and what have you. It's a damn fine move. It's a nasty looking move, kind of, I guess what would you call it technically, an inverted gut wrench pile driver? Certainly looks like a damn good move. I mean, Chuck Taylor's kind of one of those guys who's very versatile, you know. He's got a lot of the comedy in his bag, but he's got some pretty wicked moves too, and this is certainly one of them, a pretty useful finisher to say the least. The Banzai drop. When I first saw Yokozuna, when he kind of came roaring into the WWF around 1992 time, you kind of immediately thought, yeah, this guy's clearly going to be around for a while. And naturally, he had a pretty appropriate finisher. A finisher that sometimes could be nice and sometimes, well, it could be nasty. If someone had managed to annoy Yokozuna, irk him in some way, maybe slight Mr. Fuji a little, they might get the nasty Banzai drop. The one where Yoko kind of kicks those legs out a little bit and then maybe just stays on a little bit longer after the 3 count than strictly necessary. Not exactly the nicest thing to do, but, well, you probably shouldn't annoy someone who's 500 pounds odd, because that's what they're going to do. And, I mean, Yokozuna just had, for someone that size, a vicious and quite athletic moveset as well. The belly-to-belly suplexes, the big run in the corner, the huge leg drop, which did slightly put Hulk Hogan to shame. All that sort of thing, and then, yeah, the Banzai drop to finish things off. Yeah, that's a cherry on top right there, to say the least. A very big cherry. The Black Arrow, another kind of aerial move, slightly more aerial perhaps than the Banzai drop. I mean, Pac is a British wrestler, but kind of me, like everyone else, probably first became aware of Pac when he was doing stuff in PWG, the matches with El Generico and what have you that were pretty damn awesome. And the Red Arrow, as was known then, was an absolutely wicked finisher. I mean, again, it's a shooting star press, but it's a shooting star press with a bit of extra, a bit of a twist, a corkscrew shooting star press. Pac pretty much nails it whenever he uses it, and often he turns it into that submission, the brutalizer as well nowadays, which again, just adds a bit extra to the combo. Either way, it's an amazing feat. Sticking with moves named Black, we have the Black Hole Slam. It's the monster, Abyss. Abyss, always come to appreciate more and more as time goes on. I don't think I was ever the biggest fan of Abyss back in the days of TNA when first actually seeing him, but you kind of appreciate the guy more and more. He certainly had a hell of a lot of staying power, Dudley, monster now turned WWE producer. And the Black Hole Slam, yeah, cool ass finisher. I mean, again, kind of like the Boss Man Slam, pretty damn cool slam to begin with. But again, you've got that extra twist. You've got the big old spin on it, and it just certainly looked... It's one of those moves that just goes so fast and just gets that impact, so to speak, especially in those six-sided rings and all that. It's just one of those moves that looks perfect in that six-sided ring when you add the spin and all that. It just looks better there than it does anywhere else. Awesome move. There's always going to be room on these lists for a nice striking finisher. In this instance, a good old-fashioned kick to the face. And here we've got Malakai Black, Aleister Black, Tommy End. It's Black Mass. Nothing like, I mean, especially when the guy in question is trained in kickboxing, a good old roundhouse kick to the face, a back roundhouse kick, a flying back kick, I don't know, whatever Eric Bischoff would probably call it back in 90s WCW. Looks absolutely smashing. Sometimes you get the little setup as well with this. You get Malakai lifting the guy up by the foot, positioning him as he's totally groggy, and then, you know, hitting the coup de grace with that big kick. Again, just looks so wicked. It's one of those that actually looks like a legitimate kick, which is always nice when it comes with a striking finisher, especially nowadays. Great move. Here we have El Generico and we have the Brainbuster. The Brainbuster was kind of dormant for years, was brought back recently when Sami Zayn won the Intercontinental title of Gunter. The corner Brainbuster is the one in question. I mean, El Generico did have a pretty damn wicked Brainbuster, a regular Brainbuster that is, in general. That used to be a pretty awesome move. He used to get a lovely snap on it. Used to be part of a tag team finisher as well when he was originally teaming with Kevin Steen. Steen would do the package driver, roll him over and then do the Brainbuster. But then, of course, the corner Brainbuster is one of those moves that it does look pretty hairy at times, especially when someone doesn't necessarily fall back into the ring as they should. They kind of end up falling out the ring. I think I remember that happening in one of the matches that Generico had with Pac, as aforementioned. It can look pretty wild. It is, and usually it's pretty sold well by the commentators, you know, proper shouts of Brainbuster and all of that. It's a dangerous looking move for sure, but then quite a few of these are. Any move is dangerous, let's face it. The Chaos Theory, Doug Williams, also used by Chad Gable. The Doug Williams one is one I prefer. I mean, again, it's a German suplex, but it's got a nice little roll with it. You know, rushing them into the corner, whacking them into that turnbuckle, and then rolling them back out and suplexing them, ideally so they land right in the centre of the ring. It's just such a nice, flashy move. I think when it comes to like either Doug Williams or Chad Gable, both of these guys do the move absolutely great. Chad Gable's done it on some pretty damn big people as well, which is awesome. I always kind of prefer Doug Williams as one, I think, because he always tends to do it in smaller rings. You often see him doing like the RH ring, or especially an FWA ring in the UK, because that shit was tiny. And it always looked good there. And also, it's another move, because he was in TNA quite a lot, it's another move that just looks really good in a six-sided ring. There's just something about some of those classic Impact moves where that six-sided ring really helps. I mean, later on we are going to have the best example of that. I think you probably might be able to guess what that one is. But yeah, I don't know, it just looks really good. It suits the six sides. Six sides just kind of make a comeback, I don't know. So we did have in the Pro Res list, we did have the Western Lariat, the Almighty Stan Hansen, quite possibly the greatest finisher of all time. We can't not have at least one Lariat on this American list, and it's going to be JBL. As much as there's plenty of Lariats around, Bradshaw, the Clothesline from Hell, you can't really knock it. I mean, as I think I said back in the Lariat video, this is a move where JBL just tends to get his whole freaking body into this move, almost ends up on the floor himself after doing it a lot of the time, and especially when it's sold well. I mean, it is an undeniable finisher. It's one of those where, you know, no matter what you think of JBL, no matter what you think of Bradshaw, whether you think, you know, he's a good guy, whether you think he's a dickhead, his finisher is kind of one of those things that's undeniable in many ways. Next up, we've got the man from Bed-Stuy, Do or Die. It's Homicide, the Notorious 187, and it's the Cop Killer, or, as it was in TNA, Gringo Killer. Vertebreaker, basically, in many ways. Obviously, could have had Shane Helms here with the Vertebreaker, the Nightmare on Helm Street, whatever you would want to call it. But I've always preferred Homicide's take on it. Homicide's take on it, again, just is that little bit speedier. The Vertebreaker kind of has a cool setup, but it's kind of an elongated setup, obviously set up a lot more like the originator of the move, the Kodomi Valentine, Megumi Kudo Driver, whatever you want to call it. Whereas, you know, with the Cop Killer, kind of, Homicide cuts all it out, just gets right behind them, hooks them in, and then just goes, boom! And it's just got a really quite nasty looking snap on it. It's like, yeah, a snap Vertebreaker, which is as nasty as it sounds. And again, used at some points as part of a tag team finisher, a quite vicious tag team finisher, the combination of the Cop Killer from Homicide and the Ghetto Stomp from Low-Ki, especially in that match when it was done on Jay Lethal, Manhattan Mayhem. Yeah, that's one of those times when the big shout in ROH of "Dangerous" from Gabe Sapolsky, Jimmy Bauer, very much justified in that instance. We've got another aerial move here. I don't have too many aerial moves on this list, but there's a couple that I wanted to include. This one isn't necessarily the most famous of aerial moves, but holy hell was it amazing, considering it was like 20 years ago or more. This is the Crossfire, Jason Cross. It's a shooting star leg drop, and this was something that he was pulling in. God, this is like early TNA. This is like 2002, 2003. So you can kind of imagine just how ridiculous this move looked now. It's still a move that I'm not sure I've seen that many people really try and emulate. I mean, I know Pac, back in his early days, did used to do a shooting star senton, which is pretty damn close to this, but I don't think that's a move he's done for years. Probably just because it's too damn dangerous. And thing is, oftentimes with this move, Jason Cross, I mean, usually whenever I've seen him do it, usually tends to go off pretty well. I mean, considering just how outrageous it is as an aerial move, it's something that you're not going to see that much of even today with how aerial people are, just because it's probably so damn risky. I mean, a shooting star press can be bad enough, and then when you're adding further rotation to get a leg drop into the mix, add that to the turmoil. So, as ever, this is an alphabetical list. You've probably figured that out already, so there isn't strictly a number one. But if there was to be a number one, this next move would have a shout. It is, of course, the DDT. Now, many people have done DDTs over the years. The DDT is another one of those moves that I could do a whole video on when it comes to different variations of the DDT, users of the DDT. But in the end, we can probably all agree that there is only one number one when it comes to the DDT. Jake the Snake Roberts. He originated the move, he perfected the move. When asked what it stood for, he simply said, the end. And when he did it, it looked it. There was, for the most part, no doubt whatsoever when that DDT hit that match was over. Didn't even need to do a proper pin half the time. It was only kind of when he faced The Undertaker on his original way out of the WWF that The Undertaker got up out of the DDT, did the old sit-up, which was, when you think of it in the grand scheme of things, definitely a really big way to put Undertaker over. And there's so many famous DDTs as well. The freaking one that he did to Ricky Steamboat on the concrete, that one, still looks nasty even now, and it's the perfect form of the move. It's everything that the DDT should be. And when you combine it with how Jake himself sold it in promos, his own, almost lackadaisical way of actually doing it, the little twirl of the hand and all that, plus, that simple quote, what does it stand for? It stands for the end. It is quite possibly the greatest wrestling finisher of all time. No other DDT ever can even hope to compare for it. There's fancier DDTs, there's nastier looking DDTs, but really there is only one DDT. Chanted several times. Jake Roberts, perfection. Another move that's just about perfection, another move that was basically never ever kicked out of, another double team move. The Doomsday device, the Road Warriors, not the Legion of Doom. Legion of Doom are fine, but Road Warriors is a different matter. You can kind of see why this move was never kicked out of, because, again, it's one of those moves that looks really damn dangerous, and indeed did go on a couple of times. Poor old Henry Godwin springs to mind there immediately. Animal gets him up on the shoulders, Hawk does that clothesline from the top, and you get the big old flip as they come crashing down. And this usually happens after, the Road Warriors have beaten the hell out of their opponents for a good 5 minutes or so, generally made a mockery of their whole attempts to get in wrestling and their whole life. It's a perfect double team move. I mean, again, some of the other best double team finishers are often just variations on this move. The Briscoe brothers obviously had the springboard Doomsday device. That was pretty damn awesome as well. It's a European uppercut off the top, whether it's a body press off the top, whether it's a freaking cannonball senton off the top. They're variations on a theme, and it all starts with the Doomsday device. Even the Dudleys used it at one point. Even when it was Animal and freaking Heidenreich out there, the dark days, it was still a great move. It was still an undeniable classic. A move that cannot be improved on. Simple as that. Next up, we have Athena. We have the Eclipse, also known as the O-Face. Eclipse is probably a better name. This is kind of a variation on the old, classic three-quarter face-lock move, being the technical term, only this is kind of a corkscrew one where Athena flies off the ropes, grabs the opponent by the neck and rams them into the ground, ramming the chin into the shoulder and all of that. It's a really great move, especially when executed properly. A lot of it often does depend on the sell of the move, but then that's no different really from a stunner, I suppose. A beautiful little move. It's just one of those moves that as soon as you first saw it again, it's like, whoa, that's quite a different little one that definitely stands out. And it's a move that she's used awesomely for quite a few years now, whether it's, before WWE, in WWE, and now in ROH. Wonderful move. Baron Corbin. There's normally a lot of shit talked about Baron Corbin. I think one of the most brutal put-downs I've ever heard of a wrestler is when the guy Chef Reaction said about Baron Corbin that the closest thing he gets to Monday Night Raw is if he eats sushi at the beginning of the week. Say what you will about him, though, the finisher is undeniable. The End of Days obviously belongs on this list. I mean, the kind of thing with moves like the End of Days, like, the flatliner, the downward spiral, the complete shot, all of that. A thing that can be an issue with that move is that it does sometimes look more like it's a move that hurts the opponent taking it, as opposed to the opponent, the victim. End of Days doesn't really have that problem thanks to that ridiculous snap that Baron Corbin gets on it, like, loading it all up. That certainly helps the move, and it definitely makes sure that it doesn't look like it's a move that's actually hurting Corbin more than it's hurting the opponent. There's been some quite phenomenal End of Days over the years, especially one particular one, that tilt-a-whirl kind of one that Chad Gable took, I believe it was, at one point. And it was a move that for a long time was pretty well protected regardless of where Baron Corbin was on the card. The general rule of thumb was that if you got hit with the End of Days, that was kind of it. So yeah, it's a fantastic move. Obviously another one here that pretty much has to be on the list. The list cannot not have the F5 on it, Brock Lesnar's move. Again, when he came out and was immediately using this, it was clear just from that move alone that Brock Lesnar was going to be a pretty big deal, because it was one of the best finishers on the whole roster just immediately, and one of the most powerful ones. I mean, lifting the guy up on the shoulders, especially when done with someone particularly hefty, like certainly back in the day you can think of Mark Henry, Rikishi, obviously Big Show as well, and then just bringing them down like that. Ooh, yeah, pretty nasty. And then it became even more of a force of a nature move over the years, especially when, you know, Brock made his return and pretty much became the final boss of WWE for a good few years. The F5 has basically always been it. I mean, there's been a few others over the times, from, you know, the ridiculous, the shooting star press that never quite happened, to the submissions, of course, the key lock, which Brock is certainly pretty good at doing as well, especially when he gets that big old red face on. The Brock lock as well, that was a thing for a while, that stretch muffler. But in the end, nothing can really replace an impact move like the F5, one of the most powerful, one of the most famous impact moves really, impact finishers in wrestling history. Obviously, say what you will about the Type A personality that is Brock Lesnar, the move has to be on this list. We've got another submission move coming up, and it's kind of a take on a classic, the old figure 4 leg lock. Obviously many people have used the figure 4 leg lock, and it's an interesting sort of move. Sometimes it can look pretty weak, and it's also kind of a move that's easily reversible. You know, you make a turn and then suddenly you've reversed the whole move. And figure 4 is a great move as well, especially in the right hands, especially in Ric Flair's hands. But I've gone with his daughter. Just something about the figure 8 that just makes it little bit ahead. It's just the extra twist on it. Charlotte Flair using, you know, the gymnastics background to get that awesome bridge on it, and hey, suddenly when you've got an awesome bridge on it, the move looks even nastier, and suddenly it's that little bit harder to reverse, isn't it? It's just that, you know, kind of little thing, and it's taken obviously a move that has been used so many times over the years by so many different wrestlers. I mean, obviously most associated with Ric Flair, but it is one of the most famous submissions there is, and making it different, making it completely stand out, and making it worthy of being called a kind of corny name, I suppose, like the figure 8. It's a standout move, and again, it's a definite favourite of mine. Up next, we have another all-time classic finisher, another aerial finisher. We've got the flying elbow drop, the diving elbow drop, the big elbow, whatever you wish to call it, as done by the Macho Man, Randy Savage. Again, it's simple, but you just can't beat a good elbow drop, similar to what we had in the Puro list when we had Kairi Sane's elbow drop in there. But of course, this one is pretty much the original. I mean, when you think of elbow drop off the top rope, really Macho Man is always going to be the first that comes to mind. Obviously, back in his prime days, this move just looked so beautiful and yet so powerful. I mean, it weren't that many people, especially not people of Macho size, that had like the top rope finishers back in those days, but that one was particularly amazing. As he got older, I mean, perhaps it may have been a bit tougher to take for some people. He wasn't necessarily as dead-eye accurate as he was with it, as he was back in his younger days, but it still looked damn good regardless. It is an all-time classic, and obviously it was never not going to be in this top 50. Something a bit more modern for the next one. Here's Ace Austin, and here's The Fold. Now this is one of those flippy finishers, the ones that started with good old P.T. Williams and the Canadian Destroyer. I don't have too much of a problem myself with the Canadian Destroyer. I mean, I do kind of understand people who think that, yeah, maybe it looks a little contrived, the whole flipping piledriver thing. But again, something like The Fold, which I suppose is kind of an evolution of that sort of thing, is something that kind of fixes those problems somewhat. You know, you've got the nice running start, the grabbing of the neck, and then just wrenching it dramatically for this awesome looking flipping DDT. One of those moves that definitely looks like, yeah, that's a damn good finisher right there. It was always kind of nice back with the Canadian Destroyer when P.T. Williams got a running start on it, always kind of made it get a bit more snap on it, and it's a similar story with this one, similar story with The Fold, and definitely as far as this sort of flippy kind of finisher goes, I really like this one, and if I was going to have one of these represented on the list, I decided that this one would be the one. Here's another classic, it's the Frog Splash. Of course, there's many people who've got frog splashes in their arsenal, you know, whether it's the Lowdown D'Lo Brand, that's a pretty good one. But obviously this is Eddie Guerrero's. Eddie Guerrero was just flawless at it. And I mean, there's kind of a fairly unique story as well with this one, in that in many ways it's a long line of tribute. Eddie Guerrero started using the frog splash as his primary finisher in tribute to his former tag partner, the Love Machine Art Barr, and he started using it from there. And now, of course, in today's world, we have Dirty Dom using the frog splash as his finisher and, you know, paying homage to his pappy. But yeah, of course, again, for all the many people who have used the frog splash over the years, even when it comes to, I mean, of course, Rob Van Dam would be another one really high up here. Obviously, that's pretty damn high up as well, but I think in a battle between the two, in a battle between Eddie Guerrero and Rob Van Dam, I just do have to give the edge to Eddie Guerrero. He is one of my very, very favourite wrestlers after all, so obviously I can't not have him on here. Speaking of another move that a lot of people use, next up we kind of have the spear, or well, in this case we have the Gore, we have Rhyno. Again, there's lots of spears. I mean, spear especially just seems to be a move that more and more people just use. It's mutating, like almost half the WWE roster at some point seems to have a spear as their finishing move. And of course, there's a lot of good spears. Obviously, Goldberg would have been close here. You can't knock his spear. You can't knock Roman Reigns' spear. You can't knock Braun Breaker's spear. You can knock Edge's spear, although there have been a couple of good ones of those over the years. But in the end, I had to go with the Gore. And, I mean, the Gore is obviously, you know, as intense a move as it gets. I mean, Rhino's sort of got that perfect build for a move like this, you know, stocky, built like, you know, this massive ball of bastard. But also, one other thing I really like about this move is that, as far as finishers go, Rhyno recently had an incredible quote. This is one of my favourite quotes related to finishers and, you know, what makes a finisher what it is. Rhyno said in an interview not too long ago, "Well, no one ever kicked out of the Gore." And the person who was interviewing, I'm not entirely sure who was interviewing, was like immediately thinking, clearly remembering like the times that people have kicked out of the Gore and kind of questioning it. And then Rhyno was like, "If someone kicked out, I hit them with a spear. I did not hit them with the Gore." There's a difference. You may not know that there's a difference just from looking, but there is a difference. That's just a lovely bit of wrestling logic right there. Absolutely love that. And yeah, the Gore's obviously got to be on the list. Kind of have another move that, again, quite a few people have in their arsenal next. The Crossroads, Last Rites, Test Drive. There's a few of these. I mean, obviously the Crossroads is a brilliant example of that, especially when certain people sold it. I mean, Kenny Omega selling it, he'd bloody take that one right on top of his head. But my favourite one of these, which is a little bit different from the others, is Chris Hero's, the Hero's Welcome. Chris Hero doesn't necessarily get the same snap as other people do, people like Cody Rhodes, people like Christopher Daniels, but he adds a lift to it, which always kind of makes it think, you know, it's not as fast a move, but it's a more graceful move. It's kind of a more powerful move in his hands, especially when it kind of fits Chris Hero's build very well. The way that he does it just kind of glides them along and then bands them down. Also, another reason why I really like this one in particular is that it can be adapted to being a tag team move. Not only do you have the Heroes Welcome, the regular one, you've got the Heroes Welcome Kings of Wrestling edition, the assisted Heroes Welcome, when, you know, Chris Hero applies the Heroes Welcome, Claudio grabs them on the other side, and just makes it look just that little bit more nastier. The Heroes of Welcome Kings of Wrestling edition. Really like that one. So this is kind of here both as a singles move and a tag team move. So we're about halfway through. We've got another striking finisher next. Obviously I couldn't not have Will Ospreay on here. He is kind of one of my favourite modern wrestlers, and for him I've gone with the Hidden Blade. Because, you know, it's a chance to get a nice elbow on this list. I mean, when it comes to striking finishers, particularly in a Western wrestling in the USA, you tend to get kicks, you get big boots, you get knees a couple of times. Not so much in the way of elbows. Oh, obviously lariats as well, can't forget lariats. Not so much in the way of elbows all the time. I mean, actually, the aforementioned, the last entry, Chris Hero, he's got a good few nasty elbows in his arsenal. But yeah, nasty elbow certainly applies to the hidden blade. Again, it's just got a good setup about it. It's the sort of move that, you know, you can have that kind of big build up to, that sweet chin music-esque thing, or you can just have it come ripping in out of nowhere and absolutely sending the opponent doolally. And yeah, I do love a bit of an elbow. It's kind of weird, I don't think 10 years ago, I wouldn't have necessarily ever expected it to be Will Ospreay who kind of keeps a certain legacy of Mitsuharu Misawa going, whether it's using elbows as his main strike or even adopting the friggin' Tiger Driver 91. But weirdly it seems to work. Here's another one who's got plenty of strikes in his arsenal, Low Ki. Low Ki is obviously famous for all of his kicks, lots of kicks, usually some quite a bit stiffer than the norm, to say the least. I think lots of wrestlers can attest to that over the years. Low Ki is probably most famous for the double stomp, but I've kind of gone for the finisher that he used in his earlier days, back when I first became aware of him. I've gone with the Key Crusher, also sometimes called the Key Crusher 99. Again, this, when I first saw this, just seemed like a really damn cool move, kind of getting up. I mean, it's kind of, I suppose it's a variation a bit on a Michinoku Driver, in a way. Kind of Michinoku Driver-esque, Samoan Driver-esque, maybe. Kind of with a bit of a fisherman thing going on. Sometimes it could be nicely spun around. A couple of times it could even be executed off the top rope. This was definitely a cool finisher for the original days of Low Ki, you know, super intense karate man, Low Ki, kung fu man. Which, kind of a corny-ass character, but certainly one he played well, because, hey, Low Ki certainly did have that intensity in the ring, even if sometimes it was perhaps a bit misdirected. Obviously, the double stomp, the ghetto stomp, the warrior's way, whatever you wish to call it, that's damn cool too, and that's pretty much become Low Ki's main finisher for the majority of his career. But, I still absolutely love the Key Crusher, so I'm sticking that one on there. Here's another pretty cool one that's from a set of moves that generally I'm not usually big on. Here's the lumbar check with Cedric Alexander. Now the thing about these moves often is, I suppose these moves kind of like double knee backbreakers. One of the troubles with these moves is, again, kind of like, as I mentioned with the End of Days, with like the flatliner and the downward spiral. Sometimes it can look like a move that seems like it would do more damage to the person actually applying it. That's kind of an issue I always had with the backstabber, kind of an issue that I had a bit with the code breaker, so I'm not necessarily a huge fan of those moves. And Cedric Alexander's move kind of belongs in the same field, but again, it kind of fixes the problem. Indeed, it kind of fixes the problem in a similar way to what the End of Days does, in that it just has such a ridiculous snap on it. It's a very fast move, just quickly grab them up, fly them up, and then bang! And it actually looks like, especially with a good sell, it looks like a proper almost impalement on those knees, on Cedric Alexander's knees. It just looks freaking like, oh, like, yeah, that's it. Like, it's often, I mean, a backbreaker these days isn't, it takes something quite special for a backbreaker to be, I think, a very believable match ender. But I think in this case, in the case of the lumbar check, it most definitely is. Superb move, absolutely has to be here. The Mandible Claw is certainly one of the most famous finishes on this list, and it is also one of the most unique. Apparently invented by Dr. Sam Shepard, this is of course a move where you get your two fingers and you stick them right under the tongue of your opponent, as made famous by Mankind. Certainly a move that has an ick factor to it, certainly a move that apparently when Mick Foley first said that he should use the move, some people did say apparently, well, why wouldn't I just bite down on your fingers? Which, of course, if you actually were to apply it properly, so I've heard, you certainly would not be able to do. Let alone the fact that seeing as the fingers are under your tongue, you'd also have to bite through your tongue, which obviously wouldn't be pleasant. An absolutely fabulous move. Certainly I remember when first seeing Mankind, it was certainly a move that made you go, ugh. And then, of course, as Mankind became ever bigger, became ever more of a face, it became a good vehicle for his mascot, Mr. Socko, which of course, you know, being a dirty sock, gave it perhaps even more of a nicky factor than the old, you know, shield on the fingers used to. a great move, of course, one that doesn't need much of an introduction. The One-Winged Angel, Kenny Omega, another quite well-protected move, one that's very, very rarely been kicked out of, although I think it was a couple of times early on in Kenny Omega's career before he really started using it as a finisher. Of course, it's kind of got a bit of a nerd factor, named after the Uber-son from, well, my favourite game anyway, Final Fantasy VII. It's a great move, you know, it's got the electric chair setup, similar to Kenny Omega's other earlier move, the Kreuzraff, which is a pretty cool move in its own right. But I think, yeah, the One-Winged Angel, definitely an awesome move. Kenny Omega did get on the Puro list, as I recall, with the Kreuzraff, but I think I've put One-Winged Angel here. Of course, it's something that obviously was very well used in Puro when he became a superstar, but also certainly a move that's been used a lot in America as well. So I think Kenny Omega is probably one guy who, yeah, wants a place on both lists. He's been incredibly successful in Japan, he's been incredibly successful in America, and this is a phenomenal move. Here we have a move that is all about technique and is, well, as corny as the pun always was, it's absolutely perfect. It's the perfect plex. Of course, it's a fisherman's suplex, but fisherman's suplex is just always such a swanky move when executed right, and Curt Hennig always did it right. And it was kind of a cool move, I think, that really stood out in the day, because especially in those days back in 1980s WWF, everyone was all about power, big power moves, you know, dropping the leg, the big press slam. But here, with the perfect plex, you kind of had something different. You had just get them nice and roll them over, lock those fingers, there's nowhere for the other guy to go, and it's a free count. And also, speaking of power, Mr. Perfect, over the years, was able to put this on some pretty big people. He even managed to, in the WCW days, put the Perfect Plex, or Hennig Plex, I suppose as it was then, on the freaking giant, Paul White, which is no mean feat to say the least. Here's another move that I could easily do a whole video on, the Pile Driver. The Pile Driver has thankfully managed to get a bit of its swagger back in recent years. There was a time when it became pretty overused, as far as like big companies go anyway, specifically WWE. It became pretty overused and became a pretty weak move. I mean, Jerry Lawler used it a lot as his finish, of course, in WWF, but he was kind of a comedy jobber at most points there. But when I think of Pile Driver, when I think of like the king of the move, the guy who is undisputedly the master of it, I'd always have to go with Mr. Wonderful here, Paul Orndorff. Paul Orndorff had an absolutely flawless pile driver. It had all the great components of a pile driver. It had the helplessness of the opponent, the swagger of the man applying it, and then just the massive impact. I mean, a good pile driver certainly should look like you've just driven your opponent's top of their head directly into the mat. It should look friggin' lethal, and in Paul Orndorff's hands, it certainly pretty much always did. He just knew how to execute that move to an absolute turn, even often had a little turn about it, a little quarter turn almost, just to really ram it home. So yeah, when it comes to pile driver, I mean, there's a lot of names here that are pretty damn awesome with the move, from the aforementioned Jerry Lawler, of course, thinking more to his Memphis days, Terry Funk, but Paul Orndorff, yeah, kind of like Jake Roberts and the DDT, he is unquestionably the number one. Here we have the perfect move for the six-sided ring. I've talked about a couple of moves that really just seem to look great in that ring, but no move really suits that six-sided ring more than the pounce. And a great move as well for the guy who did it, Monty Brown. Monty Brown, former football player, so why not have a whopping big football tackle as your finisher? And, you know, have a crisscross that just ends in thoroughly nasty fashion, just ramming your body at full speed into the opponent. Especially in the six-sided ring, this move just looked incredible. I think it's a move that really almost doesn't work anywhere else aside from the six-sided ring. Like with the six sides, you kind of have the advantage of almost having a question as to, you know, where on earth's the opponent coming from, you know. It gets even more discombobulating. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a pounce in a four-sided ring as such. It's looked cool when done by folks like Keith Lee. but Monty Brown six-sided ring pounce is just the perfect application of the move. That's where it looked the best. Here we have Super Dragon's Psycho Driver. Kind of a similar move in many ways to stuff like the Burning Hammer. There's a kind of safer version of this done by Bianca Belair as the Kiss of Death. The Psycho Driver though is a bit more of a ramming the guy's head into the ground type thing. Super Dragon was always such a great guy to watch on the indies. One of those guys who wasn't necessarily one for psychology, you know, ring generalship and all that, but if you wanted damn cool moves, Psycho Driver, all of that, Super Dragon was certainly up there. And there are of course 3 different Psycho Drivers. This one's more for the original, but you've got the Psycho Driver 2, which was more of a vicious pump handle type move. You had the Psycho Driver 3, which is kind of similar to this, only it's got a cutthroat thing going on. And of course with Super Dragon you had so many other classic moves as well. You had the Barry White Driver, you had the Curb Stomp, the Violence Party, which is basically just a load of punches and elbows in the corner. You had that freaking spinning wheel kick that he used to do, springboard style. Just an awesome wrestler, a really important wrestler in the indies as well, considering that along with all these cool matches and just generally being a dick and confronting fans who chanted his name a lot, he did also have a big hand in PWG. So yeah, Psycho Driver, definitely on here. Here's a move that I've already talked about once before in the Powerbomb video. Obviously it had to be here as well. Razor Ramon, Scott Hall, the Razor's Edge, the Crucifix Powerbomb. Again, back in the day, this is just a move that looked wicked. God, wicked, sounding very 90s, but then that's appropriate for this move, I suppose. Getting them right up over your back, lay them out in the crucifix position, such as it were, with all the biblical connotations that may have, and then just bring them down to the ground. Apparently not the nicest finisher to take. Scott Hall always used to say to people when introducing them himself, don't forget to tuck your head in on my finisher, and you can see that if you didn't tuck your head in, then, well, that'd probably end up being bad news. But yeah, as much as it may not have been the best finisher to take in the world, certainly looks damn cool. Gotta love the Razor's Edge. Again, I already talked about this one in my Powerbomb video because it was most certainly a move that belonged there. And while there's been a good few other crucifix bombs, you know, the high cross that Sheamus did and all of that, the Razor's Edge, the kind of almost falling tree nature of that move, is always going to be the one that has the edge. Literally. Here we have another move that's pretty much a universally agreed classic. Originally, this would have been known as the Ace Crusher. Old Johnny Ace, you know, dynamic dude and all that. But it's not here under that name. This is, of course, well, I couldn't really pick between the RKO and the Diamond Cutter. Either way, it's one of the greatest finishers of all time. This move is pretty much the perfect move for just coming out of nowhere, just as the meme goes. When I first really became familiar with it was watching DDP, of course, Diamond Dallas Page back in the 90s, and it was a move that he could perform in so many different ways. Of course, he could just do it as a flash counter, he could properly set it up with the big old ban and that, he could do it from a fireman's carry, he could do it off the top rope, he could do it as a powerbomb once, as I recall. It was such a killer move, such a great move, and perfectly fit the character. And it's kind of a similar story, of course, with old Randy. The RKO has been probably one of the most loved finishers for the WWE for, well, certainly of all time, certainly for the past 20 years, because again, it's something that he can always pull out, again, in even more ways than DDP could. There have been obviously so many utterly famous RKOs over the years, the counter to the curb stomp, obviously the counter to Evan Bourne's shooting star press. I mean, just the whole from out of nowhere that became a meme at one point. It's a beautifully executed move. There's so many ones that I can think of as favourites. There's getting people off the ropes with it. Sometimes that looks a bit contrived, but when it doesn't, again, that looks magical. What can you say? Whether it's the RKO, whether it's the Diamond Cutter, one of the greatest finishing moves of all time, obviously it's on this list. Here we're going back to the 80s for Ravishing Rick Rude, the Rude Awakening, the best example I can think of a good old-fashioned neck breaker. Again, really, the thing about this move, especially when compared to other neck breakers, is it is pretty much all in the presentation. It is, of course, best performed on various jobbers. Obviously, you've got the big start up to the match, you've got Rick Rude's whole preamble, you've got him beating the jobber up a fair bit, and then, well, he tends to just do this one slowly, cinch them into the move, you know, grind his hips a bit, bring them down, and then of course you get the lackadaisical pin on top of it. Kind of similar, I suppose, in a few ways to the DDT, in that, you know, it's such a vicious finishing move that you really don't need to make an effort after you've done it to actually pin the guy. It's just clearly all over. One of those classic finishing moves of the time, and certainly the best example that I can think of when it comes to a good old-fashioned neckbreaker, similar to, you know, the DDT, the pile driver, other moves like that previously in the list. When you think neckbreaker, yeah, this is the first thing that comes to mind. They don't get any more classic perhaps than this, certainly when it comes to submission moves. The sharpshooter. Everyone, certainly of my generation, surely has so many fond memories of this move, because, you know, we were all that kid in the classic advert, the one who's, you know, shouting, "Brett!" He was my favourite, still is. And of course, it's a beautiful finisher. It's the best example, again, that I can think of. I mean, again, there's lots of wrestlers who use the Scorpion Deathlock, the Sasori Gatame. You've got Sting, you've got various other people who paid tribute to this. But Brett's is still the most glorious one. And it's just a fun move in general. I mean, certainly this move was always fun when you were a kid, because it's always the move that you'd try to put on to your friends. Like, you'd all, you know, try and put on the sharpshooter, which usually would end up in a bit of a mess, because it's not actually the easiest move to put on, as some pretty terrible examples of the sharpshooter over the years have bore out. Remember when The Rock used to try and do it? Ugh, they used to look pretty nasty. But yeah, it's always kind of a fun move in that way. It's like, yeah, I've figured out how to do the sharpshooter properly. And thing is, when Brett did it as well, it's like when Brett did it, no matter who he was facing, he always made sure to put the absolute most in it. Even if he was facing someone who clearly had no chance of beating him, he'd still cinch that sharpshooter in, wrench it right back, and make sure to give that little fist pump after he's done it. I mean, you could look at that seriously and think, oh yeah, well done Brett, you've just beaten, I don't know, the Berserker or Skinner. But either way, he'd celebrate that just as if it was if he'd beaten, I don't know, Hulk Hogan or whatever, or The Undertaker. Legendary wrestler, legendary submission, everyone knows the sharpshooter, obviously it's in this top 50. Here we've got another double team finisher, a more modern one. I do like the Shatter Machine from the FTR, the Revival. Again, it's a move, it's quite similar, of course, in many ways to the 3D, really. It is essentially a 3D, only this time it finishes in a code breaker as opposed to a cutter. But, you know, just as the 3D is a damn good move, that obviously was on this list, same kind of applies to this one. I mean, one thing about tag team moves is that a lot of time they do require a bit of setup, which again can kind of diminish the effect of the move. I mean, obviously that doesn't necessarily matter in the case of something like a Doomsday device, but sometimes if it takes a bit of time to set up one of these moves, it can take you out of it a bit. Whereas with something like the Shatter Machine, or indeed the 3D that we saw earlier, that's not necessarily the case. Sure, you might get the two guys gearing up for it, getting ready if they're, you know, if it's kind of a coup de grace type thing, but then there's other times when, especially in a kind of sort of faster paced match that guys like the FTR tend to be getting on with, there's times when this finisher can just come out of nowhere, and when it's a move that involves two people doing it, a move that comes out of nowhere is a pretty cool thing to have. Up next we've got good old Roderick Strong. Roderick Strong, never the wrestler with the biggest personality. I mean, his main personality is what kind of arrogant Killswitch Engage fan, but damn if he isn't good in the ring, and damn if he doesn't have so many different ways to beat guys. I mean, Roderick Strong's got various ones. He's got the End of Heartache, as I said, big Killswitch Engage fan, which is the ridiculous suplex backbreaker that he does. He's got the Stronghold, which is even nastier looking than a classic old Walls of Jericho is. But my favourite is always going to be the Sick Kick, because it's exactly what it says on the tin. The Sick Kick, Roderick Strong just runs full pace at an opponent and boots them in the head. Kind of similar, I suppose, to the Claymore. The Claymore by Drew McIntyre is another finisher that I think is absolutely great, and if it wasn't for the Sick Kick, it certainly would have been on this list. But it's just that when I think of this move just running in and giving that guy a big old flying boot, when Roderick Strong does it, that's just the one I think of. It's especially one of those things, I guess, where, you know, the old exaggerated slapping of the leg really does come to the fore. Just really, again, just gives it that extra oomph. So I know sometimes it annoys people, like people are always like, leg slapping, but, you know, sometimes moves just get that extra kick out of it, and this is definitely one of them. It's just a brilliant bloody move. It's a simple move, but seriously effective, and of about the 1,000 or so finishers that I think Roderick Strong's had over the years, this would be my favourite one, and so it's in the top 50. Here we have the Sister Abigail, old Bray Wyatt. Again, this could have been, there's two moves that I think of here, or two variations on this move. This could also be the Blade Runner by Jay White. They are, of course, kind of the same move. That, again, that kind of inverted thing, not sure how you really describe it, sort of like the Crossroads, but a different angle. But Bray Wyatt, the late great Bray Wyatt, I think wins this again. It's a presentation thing. It's like the Rude Awakening. It's a perfect move for the character because, well, it gives Bray Wyatt an opportunity to really get into his gimmick. He's got the guy by the head, and, you know, he gives them that little kiss. It is, you know, that Bray Wyatt character, that almost ministerial cult leader type that's come out of the weeds. He's blessing the guy. He's almost saying, you know, this is you being anointed, before then slamming them into the mat viciously. So yeah, that kind of adds to the greatness of the move, adds to the weirdness and brilliance of the whole Bray Wyatt presentation, certainly when it was at its best, and it's certainly a move that looks effective enough from just a plain old power point of view to be a creditable finisher against damn near everyone. And, you know, it's a shame that Bray Wyatt isn't around anymore to keep doing this move to people. Another classic here, the Spinebuster, as performed by the almighty AA Arn Anderson. Once again, this is kind of the same deal as the Rude Awakening, the DDT, in that you have a move here that is performed by quite a lot of people, but I think most people tend to agree that Arn Anderson's Spinebuster is the best one. I mean, it's got the sort of, you know, turn around the 180 degrees turn, but it's just done with such speed and snap and power. I mean, there's a couple of others who kind of tried to imitate this similar Spinebuster, Triple H being an obvious example, but could just never quite get the same quickness that Arn Anderson got with it. The only other person I seem to recall who was kind of able to emulate it pretty well was, of all people, David Young. If anyone remembers David Young from back in 2000s TNA days, he had a pretty damn good Spinebuster. And obviously there's a lot of other Spinebusters of different types that are pretty good as well, not many of which are necessarily finishers, but Arn Anderson's Spinebuster was definitely one that was very believable as a finisher. And of course, who can forget that moment when he came busting into the ring at WrestleMania X8 and did that Spinebuster to the Undertaker that a lot of people thought was going to snap the streak then and there. A classic moment and a classic move. We have Kevin Owens here, although it would probably be more accurate to say Kevin Steen. We've got a lot of finishers here for Kevin Steen, but the one that I did want to highlight, one that's not really been used for a long time by him, and it's easy to see why, the Steenalizer. Good God, this move is nasty. Basically, he gets the guy up on his shoulders, kind of puts them in a package of sorts on the shoulder, and then falls back on them. So kind of like a suplex, and usually Kevin Steen would also do this as a turnbuckle move. It just looks horrifying. I mean, to be honest, the turnbuckle move is bad enough. It's also a move that can perhaps look even worse when a turnbuckle is not involved. That's the move that, if you might remember, Dragon Lee used at one point and did break Hiromu Takahashi's neck. So yeah, this is a pretty vicious move. Easy to see why Kevin Steen doesn't use it anymore, but damn if it doesn't look devastating. And there's got to be room on this list for a couple of moves like this that you just look at and you just utterly wince. And of course, when it comes to dangerous moves, you can't not have Scott Steiner and the Steiner Screwdriver, one of the most dangerous moves of them all, and who boy doesn't it look it. You've got the big Hannon vertical suplex setup, and then you just brindle them down horrifically. right on the top of their skull. And of course the thing with this move is that Steiner would often perform it in matches that it didn't even necessarily need to be performed in. All those Steiner brothers squashers, where suddenly, out of nowhere, Scott Steiner will pull out a Steiner screwdriver. And hey, sometimes it won't even end the match. They'll just throw that jobber out of the ring and then, destroy the other one. Obviously, a couple of people have also used this move. Brian Cage uses it a lot nowadays as the drill claw. Later in his career, Scott Steiner did develop a, I suppose, quote-unquote, safer version of the Steiner screwdriver, one that you saw in TNA a couple of times, which did look a bit more easier to take, but still pretty damn nasty. Horrifying move, but obviously one that has to be here. Quite possibly the most famous wrestling finisher of them all next. I mean, there's a few that would also be there, obviously the leg drop, the people's elbow, but the Stone Cold Stunner probably has to be number one here when it comes to famous finishers. I mean, what can you say about this move that hasn't already been said? It's the classic move to imitate, the kick to the stomach, maybe flip the bird, tell them they're number 1 or number 11, and then bring that chin right down on your shoulder. It's a classic. Of course, the thing with the stunner is that the move itself, the executor of the move, whether it's Steve Austin or indeed Kevin Owens, as we just talked about, a lot of it is really down to the sell. Like, the sell is often what really makes a great stunner, because obviously you did have some people, particularly non-wrestlers, who took that move and it looked terrible because, well, their timing was all completely wrong. But then you have the amazing sells, the ones that go down in history. You had The Rock, obviously, with lots of great ones where he'd just go all over the place. You had the classic Scott Hall still, of course, where he leaped so far in the air. In recent years, Austin Theory's had a couple of good stunner sells. Shane McMahon, usually with the spitting of the beer everywhere. It's not just the stunner, really, it is the great sells of the stunner that make this one of the iconic finishing moves. Although, to be honest, it even looked good right when he first started using it, when old Stone Cold first started using it, because back then he didn't even really have the old, kick to the stomach and the big, whoop that that entails, because as soon as that kick goes in, you kind of knows what's going to happen next. He just grabbed the fella's chin and smash it into his shoulder. So yeah, it looked good pretty much from that moment on, but as Steve Austin became this juggernaut of the 90s and 2000s, it just obviously got better and better. AJ Styles is here. You can't not have a move from one of the greatest executors of any moves ever, one of the greatest technical wrestlers of all time, and of course it's got to be the Styles Clash. Styles Clash is, again, just a move whenever I can't remember when I first saw it, I guess obviously back in 2002, 2003, the early ROH TNA days. Just again, a move that stands out. Not necessarily a power move, but just a wonderful technical little creation, just a very unique move. But again, also, it could be quite a dangerous move as well for people to take. There's the old mantra that you should tuck your chin in for most moves. Whereas this one, yeah, you definitely shouldn't tuck your chin in. You should get your neck as far back as possible, because otherwise, well, bad things could happen. And even if those did kind of happen a couple of times, for the most part, they never have happened. Hell, I mean, AJ Styles in, most of the time, his technical, expertise is at such a level that he knows instinctively if someone's not going to tuck their chin, and he protects them middle of the move. Like, that's the sort of level that AJ Styles is at. So yeah, obviously another move that really needs to be on this list. There are many moves here that a list like this would just be incomplete without. They have to be here. And the Styles Clash, whether it's executed normally, whether it's executed off the top rope, whether it's executed as a supreme counter, or whether it's executed in a way that saves a person from a bad injury, is one of the best finishers about. And hey, the iconic moves don't exactly stop. It's the sweet chin music. 'Tis nothing but a simple sidekick, isn't it? But again, it's a sidekick that can work on so many different levels. It can work with, the classic big old setup. I mean, back in the 90s when Shawn Michaels used to do the setup, the old big banning of the foot, we're talking back in, the boyhood dream days. Usually he would end up connecting with it. The crowd would get their satisfaction. When he came back, Shawn Michaels didn't used to necessarily connect with the Sweet Chin Music that much when he did the old big setup. I think it got to a stage where pretty much almost 9 times out of 10 the guy would grab the leg. But at that point, the Sweet Chin Music again kind of became more of the move out of nowhere, the big counter. And again, there's been so many great counters with the Sweet Chin Music over the years. Obviously, the most legendary ones being Shelton Benjamin and Rey Mysterio Jr. when both of them came flying off the ropes and straight into a foot that knocked their teeth down their throat. So many other great matches have featured Sweet Chin Music counters. The incredible match that Shawn Michaels and John Cena had on Raw that finished with a snap Sweet Chin Music. And again, kind of like the Stunner, you've also got the guys who sell the move absolutely beautifully. And the main one that I think of is Randy Orton in that regard. When Randy Orton got hit with a Sweet Chin Music, he really sold it like a pure knockout blow. Those are the most memorable sells of the move I can think of. And of course, there is even the emotional moment with the move, when the Sweet Chin Music retired Ric Flair. Again, so many moments with this move means you can't not have it on the list. Here's one where we have quite a few guys who use this move, and I couldn't really pick between them. I couldn't really highlight one because they all do it damn well. It's the Tiger Driver 98. Now, this move was originated in Joshi back in like the late 80s, 90s, but largely it's a move that's been done by American wrestlers, mainly American indie wrestlers. The Tiger Driver 98 is a move that Excalibur's done. Excalibur, I think, is the guy who really came up with the Tiger Driver 98 name, I believe. You've got Kid Cash, who uses it as the moneymaker, Donovan Morgan, Josh Prohibition, and obviously you have the late great Jay Briscoe, who uses it as the Jay Driller. And even from there you've got other guys who've used it not necessarily as a finisher, Kenny Omega, Cody Rhodes. No matter what, it's a brilliant move, and pretty much all of these guys execute it pretty much the same way. It is a double underhook pile driver. Not necessarily as great as, you know, the classic, iconic, standard pile driver. Again, Paul Orndorff is always going to be the number one there. But the double underhook just adds, again, that little bit of an extra oomph to the move. Gives it that little twist, which is always appreciated. Speaking of pile drivers, again, you can't not have this one. You can't not have the Tombstone. Tombstone, it goes without saying. I mean, when Undertaker first debuted, the Tombstone used to quite particularly be nasty. There's some real vicious, you know, classic, you know, Gorilla Monsoon Tombstone City days when he always used to say that. Some quite nasty tombstones there really look like old Taker dropped that guy like a proverbial sack of spuds. Looked like they definitely needed the body bag afterwards. Then as Undertaker, you know, becomes a top guy, it pretty much became the uber finisher, like the one that very, very, very few people were able to kick out of. There's time when you'd basically only really see a Tombstone kick out at like a WrestleMania, and even if one didn't necessarily get someone, a second one usually would. Also, again, even a move like this one, considering that it's done by a near 7-foot guy in the shape of The Undertaker, has had some brilliant out-of-nowhere moments almost, counters into the Tombstone, even right back to the early days when Jimmy Snuka got counted into the Tombstone in a spot that perhaps didn't quite come off as intended, but considering how big a guy like Snuka was and what they were trying to do, still went pretty damn well. And you've got other people trying to do a Tombstone themselves and then getting flipped into one. You've got the classic Shawn Michaels doing the moonsault and getting countered into the Tombstone. And then, of course, you've got the super finisher, the big old jumping Tombstone, the one that ended Shawn Michaels' career. So many moments with this move, and, you know, obviously a move like this that was used as a top finisher for, well, 20, 30 years. Of course it's on the list. Our second to last move here is our final tag team move, and it is taking us to ECW times. I had to have a spot for the total elimination, or to be more accurate to try and do it in the Joey Styles way, the total elimination. I can't really do it, who can? Simple enough tag team move really. You position a poor sod in the middle, one of you does a spin wheel kick, the other does a leg sweep, and the other guy just gets utterly screwed, essentially. Again, this is a move, when I first started watching ECW came on UK television thanks to Bravo back in 1998 or so. And when I first saw the Eliminators, older Perry Saturn and John Cronus, and they're doing this move, plus all the other stuff they did, again, not necessarily a team for those who like, you know, psychology, ring generalship and all that, but certainly a good team for those who like lots of moves, and certainly back in those days, well, hell, still, let's be honest, there's nothing like a good load of moves, a good, ridiculous spot fest. And Saturn and Cronus were certainly damn good at that. No matter how big they were, they just fly all over the ring. And the total elimination was a perfect finisher for them. It showed off their striking power and their athletic power, their coordination, even though they were both pretty damn big guys. Great move. And lastly, the final move on this list, we go to Victoria, the Widow's Peak. Widow's Peak has always been, I think, really loved as a move. The kind of a neck breaker with a gory special style setup. It's a move that looks legitimately quite nasty. It's a move that was perfect as well for the Victoria character when she first came in, that kind of really, you know, twisted in the head type character. Because a character like that should have a move that could easily look like it legitimately injured someone. Again, especially with a cell that, you know, someone doesn't necessarily go straight down after they've had a Widow's Peak. They tend to kind of just flop down because they've had such a jarring impact on their neck. It's a brilliant move, and, you know, Victoria would even kind of look around, you know, wild-eyed afterwards, you know, not even really caring about what she's done, but just, you know, this is the... And a pretty good way to finish this whole thing up. And there we are. 50 finishers from American wrestling, from the Wesley, other side of the pond and all of that. Hopefully this is a nice compliment to the Puro list. Hopefully you've enjoyed me kind of doing it in a more unscripted style. Hopefully it's not too rambly. I've tried to clean out various flubs that I've done, but I'm sure there's probably a few that made it through. But yes, hopefully you've enjoyed me talking about all these great moves for an hour. I'm sure there'll be plenty of other move videos coming up, as well as obviously more documentary type stuff. But here we are, and I'm sure you'll have plenty of opinions on what should have been on this list or what should not have been on this list in the comments. Thank you for watching this whole thing, and as ever, I shall say bye for now.